Welcome to the Equipping Leaders podcast, Leader Study Series. I'm Natasha, a leader development professional and overall leadership enthusiast.
And I'm Corey, a program manager and an emerging people leader, thus a leadership enthusiast.
We are doing a leader study of the TV show Z Nation, deconstructing the leaders, leadership decisions, and team dynamics of the characters on the show to look at how leadership is all around us. And even if we're not in a position of leadership, we can still demonstrate it in our actions, responses, and in the opportunities around us.
Z Nation aired from 2014 to 2018, but if you haven't seen it yet, there will be spoilers in these episodes. In this episode, we're talking about Z Nation Season 1, Episode 6, Resurrection Z. Let's jump in.
Okay, so team is still coming together. People are fighting through their own demons. But what we're also starting to see now in this series is people's relationships outside of the team and how they leverage those. So we're coming in on episode 6, Resurrection Z. And this one is interesting. There's a little bit of a religious cult thing going on, which I think that we'll call back to some of our previous statements about what is a leader and what is, maybe not a leader, just a dictator or somebody else who's in certain positions of authority. But yeah, there were a lot of interesting things that happened and team members who I didn't expect to step up and start to evolve. So I feel like this is really where we know some things about people and now their leadership is evolving. So what stood out to you?
I think right off the bat, right, the piece with Jacob and that whole idea of the zombies and how he sort of has that more cult-like leader control over people. I thought that was really interesting. As well as like sort of the team, right when the episode opens, they're kind of sitting around and they're discussing about like how they want to move forward, right? Talking about Murphy. That's the mission. So you kind of have this weird little like team huddle that's happening. I believe Murphy's like taking a personal hygiene break, as it were, right on the side of the road, and they're sort of having this discussion about how he looks because now his color's changing. He's almost all the way blue. He shaved his head, and so I thought that was interesting because that's kind of like corporate world, right? You'll have those little team huddles every once in a while, like maybe the mission's evolved. Again, thinking from like a tech background, right? Maybe the code stack has started to shift. Maybe, whatever the UX UI guy came back with or accessibility guy, it's really starting to change the mission. And some of the stuff doesn't look like how you originally envisioned it or what the original goal was. So you're doing this reassess. And I thought it was really cool that, you sort of had Garnett and Warren that they sort of facilitated that conversation. They didn't lead it. They let the team lead it and get that team's feedback. And so they were really just in receive mode and picking that up and just sort of trying to ask a few pointed questions. And so I thought that was a really interesting sort of way to open up, because you had this totalitarian piece of Jacob and this cult-like leadership thing. And like, there was no room for other options. It was what he said. And then now you had this far more like democratic process. So I thought that was a cool, like, yin and yang, compare, contrast between two different styles.
I also made note of that initial conversation they were having there at the truck for multiple reasons. So one, absolutely what you're saying, where what does everybody else see that maybe we don't see as the leader? So you'll see other things. You have different relationships with different stakeholders or partners or collaborators. So, what are we thinking? There was also another aspect of it where, and I've said it before, I'm not a fan of how Murphy is in general treated. But I thought it was also calling to, like, they didn't ask him, right? They made like a joke about him getting a haircut. Nobody has actually asked him what is going on. And so I think that also really shows that, like, sometimes people fail in this way where they talk more about people than they do to them. And so they didn't bring him into that fold and all that. And I understand he's the mission and all that, but at the same time, he probably would have had some opinions too, or been able to kind of say like, I know this or I don't know that, but they didn't even think to ask at that time.
Yeah, that's he's done things up until this point to like prove that he's also like either wants to be or is a part of the team, right? Like he's tried to help protect people. He's taken like some personal risk, and stuff like that. So it's like they don't. It's almost like they're trying to dehumanize him because I think they all know in the back of their mind when it comes to that goal of getting him to California. Once they leave him there, it's probably not going to be super positive things that happen to him in the course of like trying to make that vaccine, right? There's going to be some poking and prodding, and because for him to get to the point that he's at was already against his will, right? So I almost wonder if there's that attempt to dehumanize under the veil of for the greater good, just for their own like mental faculties and sanity of like he is a human, but we're going to pretend like he isn't, just so that we can make it through this whole process. So like that shared denial.
And I think that, yeah, he's made little steps towards being a member of the team, but nothing grand. Like there's no thing where, at least from my perspective, we have no indication yet that Murphy is all in as a team member here. He still very much is a prisoner being transported, but you're right. He has had these little moments where you could see that like, he was very upset that the helicopter didn't work in a previous episode because he said, a friend of mine died trying to get to this, right? When he was talking about Doc. So he is starting to do these little things, but it's also super interesting that it's like the way he's treated. Why should he do this grand gesture at all when either it's because there's the dehumanizing aspect, but also they're not bringing him into the fold as a member of the team. Like you said, like right at the top there, he's the mission. They're not viewing him as a team member yet.
Yeah, no, that's great. And then, yeah, I was just trying to think, because like, to me, it's like I guess maybe it's a differing viewpoint, but like you have to put forth the effort first, right? Like you have to prove yourself to the team should have to prove itself to you. So I guess, I don't know. I guess you could go either way with it, really. I guess maybe it depends on the team or the situation, but he is sort of the mission. But yeah, I guess I didn't think about it like that.
I think also too that there's this, there needs to be trust on both sides. Like there's like, I don't think that someone has to prove themselves to the team or the team to them. It has to be on both sides equally at the same time. But I also know that, like, unfortunately, along the way, Murphy has not been the best team member. It's such as like hate what happened to him at the same time. Like even in like a previous episode where Mac was like, you have to kill this zombie. It was one thing. The zombie wasn't even being that aggressive or wasn't being aggressive at all. And Murphy couldn't do it. Mac had to come back and do it. Right. So there's also these things where it's almost like sometimes on teams, you give somebody a task and then they fail that task and you're like, I am trying. Like I'm trying to bring you into the fold. You're not folding. So it's super interesting. Murphy is such an interesting character just because I definitely have seen like that type of teammate. And yeah, people are toxic for a reason.
Yeah, no, that's a valid point. There you go, messing up my whole worldview again. But then what happens next? So you met Jacob with the church. They have that conversation about Murphy, and then they wind up at the camp. And I forget who it is. Is it Garnett knows the leader there? Is that it?
Yeah. So Garnett knows Joe Williams, who's the
Joe
major.
Williams. There. Yep. Yeah.
And when they first pull up to that compound too, what's interesting is they're told they have to surrender their weapons, and everybody's just kind of looking at Garnett like, that seems not like a great idea. But he makes this statement too that I think is really important, where he says is like, it's their town, their rules. So I think that's also a really important piece of, where we need to work through this, right? But also it's not just our game here. Other people have things in place for a reason. Sometimes in business and just in our professional lives, we have to work through someone else's system to get to what it is that we're trying to get to. But we have to respect that system and work through it, or or we're not going to be able to use that at all along the way. And they needed those resources. They needed that compound.
Yeah, that's a really great point, especially because, sometimes it's like you look at it as a burden, right? Like, I'm not going to give up my weapons. Like, this is a terrible idea because it's so counter to the one that you have. But then, like, also to take a step back, there's a handful of you and they have an entire town, right? So it's like, also that process looks completely opposite to me. I realize, like, their goal is to get to California. These people, it's probably to build a town, but like to devalue that and think that better, even in the face of this secure perimeter. And now, as they get into that town and there's food and sort of safety and shelter and like a very nice, like more traditional societal structure, it's like, I think like some of them come around to it for sure, but it's like, sometimes you can go in very much with your own defenses up about like what right is or how right is, and get a little bit blinded and then never see the value of the benefit or never walk away with any positives from that too, because you've already jaded yourself as to my way is the only way. So you get caught in that thinking trap. So yeah, that's a pretty good point. And I think the major does a pretty good job of like trying to put people's mind at ease, and he explains it in a very like matter of fact way. And I think he said that they were losing, I think at one point he's like, we were losing more people internally to fighting than we were to to the zombies or something like that, which is part of the reason why they said no weapons. So I thought that was interesting.
Yes. And I think too, there's the aspect of just because you do what someone else wants you to do does not mean that you've changed your mind or that you agree with that. And I think that's another big thing is people are like, well, if I do this, then it's like I'm giving up this whole value system. And it's like, you're not. Right? You're not. There are a lot of people who go along with things sometimes, even if it is against whatever, or if it feels counter, but it's like you said, this might be the way we need to do this for right now. I'm not giving anything up. My mind does not have to be changed, but in order to work through this system, I need to do this. But yeah, some people get so hard set and like, this is what I believe. That's like, and nobody's asking you to not believe that. Like, you should have weapons. It is the zombie apocalypse. Totally. This is a one-day thing, right? Or this is a very short thing. And typically, yeah, people are willing to fall on their sword for these like little things where you're like, was that worth it? Like, was that really worth it when you could have had all these other resources or relationships or stakeholders involved?
Yeah. No, and to that end too, I also think it's interesting sometimes the amount of effort and energy that leaders will spend on that individual who's dug their heels in to try to get buy-in for a one, you know what I mean? Like, obviously in this situation, the major had nothing to gain or to lose really by letting them in or not letting them in. But imagine like the time and energy that he could have wasted trying to convince them not to bring their weapons into the compound. You know what I mean? And I've seen that sort of a situation a lot where it's like, if that person is not going to come along, right? If they're not interested, why are you spending so much time on that? You know what I mean? Like you're wasting so much time and energy when we could have got it done already, even without their contributions. So I think that that's pretty interesting too. And I get that that's a slippery slope, right? That's kind of you can err too much on one side or the other. But yeah, I think it's a really fine line that I think really good leaders know how to walk pretty effectively.
You bring up something that is triggering for me.
Oh God, no.
No, in the sense of, I am very much, and here's just a strong belief that I have, but that's that, you work with the willing. And so I've heard organizations where they're like, oh, you spend 80% of your time on the bottom, whatever percent. And it's like, that's insane, because think about how far you could get everyone else, if you focus on them, but also B, you're trying to get buy-in from people who don't want to give you buy-in, which signals to everybody else that if they don't have my buy-in, we don't have to do this. Buy-in indicates that there's some sort of a choice here. And like, you definitely want to have influence. You want people to know what's going on and socialize an idea well. But when like leaders stall on that kind of stuff, it's also indicating to the people who are early adopters, who bought in and are moving forward with it, that I don't have to be working this hard, right? Because they're going to just tailor to least common denominator, right? The person who fights the hardest, that's what we're going to lean into. And so those people will either become complacent, or more often than not, they'll leave because are we moving forward or not? Like, what are we doing? Is this like the temper tantrum team where you just throw a tantrum and then we don't get to do our jobs? So yeah, it's something that is always like very, as leaders, we want to make sure everybody knows what's going on and is moving forward. But the minute you're not, like, figure it out. There's part of it that I need to do as a leader to keep you informed and all that. But it's like this whole idea of like, what are leaders responsible for? And it's like, we're responsible to, I'm responsible to people, to give them information, to keep them informed, to make sure they have the resources and the development that they need. I am not responsible for them. They're responsible for themselves.
Yeah, no, that's like a really great point. That's like a really, really great point. Sorry, yeah, now you got me thinking, because like I was because the next thing I was gonna say was, when they're sitting in that like cafeteria and they're all eating, what I thought, and like taking the break or whatever, what I thought was really interesting too was how quickly like Warren and Garnett, right? They talked about, like, they sort of said what their team needed, right? Explained who their team was, but also they yielded to what the major want. Like, they were now in his place under his rules, and they weren't asking him to change things, to do anything different. And I also was really cool the way that they were like, both for their own safety, trying to understand the process of what was happening, but like, how, well, you don't have any weapons. What if somebody turns into, right? What if somebody passes away in the night? How do you mercy them or whatever? So like, that was them just trying to make sure that their team was going to be safe in this location. But at the same time, they were gathering like knowledge, right, to make them better leaders moving forward as in the process. And then also acknowledging that he's doing something differently, that they find it interesting, and they're being like really inquisitive about that in a positive way, and then further strengthening that relationship, right? And so I thought that was like really cool and a neat illustration as well of, sometimes when you go on that business trip or working with that other team, it's important to ask them questions, right? Like, it's not always like you're trying to steal their your trade secrets or something, but that you can have that inquisitive. And there were places where he definitely didn't go as deep with maybe the why, and they were okay with that. You know what I mean? And I thought that was really, like, that they were respecting those boundaries of his, and I thought that was pretty cool.
Agreed. I think that's a really important thing where we want to get our own points across, but at the same time, understanding, like truly taking the time to understand what makes another group unique, whether it's perceived or otherwise, and also like what's important to them. At the end of the day, like, what does support look like? What does success look like? The how is going to be, people may or may not want to share that, but like, if we can really talk to someone and understand what those things are, it makes us better collaborators and it makes us better leaders.
Yeah, I do think it was interesting though too that when they were eating, and again, like, they all sat together at their own table, and like, there really wasn't much. I think 10K was trying to maybe reach out and collaborate with like one of the other people in the community that then we find out was somebody who came from Jacob's sort of flock or fold or whatever. But that they all just sort of sat together. There was no attempt to like reach out to other people in that community and like see what they liked, what they didn't like either, which I thought that was kind of interesting too, because I know sometimes going different places with our team, you sort of get you stick together and you get a little, almost, I don't want to say arrogant, but you have like this sort of cool person mentality of like, oh, we'll sit as our own little clique, and like, you miss that ability to sort of branch out and develop those new relationships or those connections. And I think, if I would almost think, Warren and Garnett could have done a better job of maybe trying to encourage the team to like reach out and meet new people, especially in this instance, because it's like, maybe you could use a few more people to help you get that mission to California or something. So I thought that was, again, I might be very much reading into something where they just couldn't afford to pay a few more extras to have some speaking lines. But I do think it was, I thought it was a pretty interesting sort of scenario of them just sort of staying together, which maybe that also shows the strength of the team too, because they weren't like at each other's throats, that they felt that they needed to go, find and talk to new people.
I think, yeah, that's very human nature. Like, who do I know here? That's who I'm going to talk to, especially if I don't know what other people's values or like how they approach different things are. It's just a safety in the social group type of thing. But I did think it was interesting where both Garnett and the Major Williams were talking about like they both wanted to recruit each other. But they both wouldn't be recruited for the same reason, right? They couldn't leave their groups because they knew they were relied upon for leadership.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that, and then so I don't know. I don't want to jump the gun, so to speak, but obviously now stuff starts going like a little sideways too, because we find out that those folks that came from Jacob's like church cult thing where didn't have the best intentions in mind, and I think it was actually 10K who figured that out, right? That they were actually kind of zombie bombs, if you will, you know what I mean, that were coming in. So and then you start to see this breakdown, and now all of those things that the Major had put into place as like safety features for the community now became like hindrances. And what I thought was really interesting was kind of instead of being understanding to like this was a really crazy sort of outlier that should have never really happened. Most of the team that we know were like, this is why you always keep your weapon, and it's so dumb that we have them all locked up in that room, and now we've got to try to like work and fight through this. And so I thought that was kind of interesting, like how negative they went towards that, like they wanted the failure almost.
Interesting. Okay. Again, I did not perceive it that way. You're good.
Are we watching the same show?
No, but I do know what you mean though. Yeah, when things started to go off the rails, I feel like, and I also don't want to jump too far ahead, but this episode starting at that point when it started to go off the rails was an arc for Murphy that was unexpected, I thought. So they're trying to like run out of the main cafeteria area. And they're like, I think it's like Doc and whoever are like, Murphy, come with us. Murphy still does not trust these people. Like he still does not, because even though it was for his perceived safety, he went through another door. Like he was like, there's still no safety with these people. So, even though their whole thing, they need to get him alive and safe to California, there's still no trust there. So I thought that was really interesting. And then I don't want to jump like too far ahead, but I'll just do it. So then later in the episode, Jacob and his flock of people are now in there. They've got the cage full of zombies, and Murphy is in with those zombies. And then when they're about to, when Pastor Jacob is about to take the life of Garnett, for the first time, even though it is very an egotistical way to do it, Murphy stands up for something on the team, right? He stops that from happening by claiming to be this like zombie messiah. And so it does stop that from happening. And then he does free everyone else when he has the opportunity. So it was just so interesting to me that like in a single episode, you have this kind of unknown team member, right? You're like your rebel, your questioner, the person who just, are they ever going to get on board? All of a sudden, and even in the same episode, is like, I don't trust these people, to like, I could do something to help this group. He has no reason to technically, right? Because he could just run off on his own, but he does. So I thought that was just a really interesting arc that we see from this team member.
See, okay. Now I don't disagree, but I do disagree in the trigger for him to do that. I did not view it as him finally having like he did everything you said, I believe is true. However, I think the driving motivator for him was once he realized when he was in that bathroom scene with the woman and the zombies came in and that one skipped right over him and then the rest of them didn't bother with him and instead, went after that one woman. I think once he started to realize that the zombies were no longer interested in him, that now gave him a power or an ability for like that put him like he now had something. He was now better than the team, right? He's clearly shown he's not the best at mercying zombies. He doesn't necessarily make the best decisions, doesn't have the best survival skills. But now a lot of that doesn't matter because the zombies won't mess with him anyway. So now he has an immediate out, right? He can just run into a horde of zombies and there's really nothing the team can do about that. So the moment that relationship stops being beneficial to him, I view it as he found his way out now, right? Like he can just leave whenever he sees fit. But I also probably was going at the episode with a bit more of a pessimistic view. So there's that. But
I like that because that's just it too, is sometimes in a group, we find our strengths and our strengths are too strong for the group. And that can be because of ego, right? Which then it's not truly a strength, but but sometimes it's like, does everybody suck except for me, right? like what is it like? How is this an equal team, an equal partnership, an equal collaboration if I am bringing the most valuable, the biggest thing, which sometimes is true and sometimes it's just an internal perception of, like maybe with Murphy, where it's like the zombies can't hurt me. But what I liked about what you said too was for me, it made me think of he finally discovered something that he could bring to the group. What is his strength in this group besides just being a passive prisoner being taken to this other place? Also, it's interesting because the thing that he feared the most, the thing that caused him the most trauma was suddenly no longer a problem for him, right? At all. And so, yeah, that's why I said, like, I do agree in some measure with everything you said, until we get to the point where he then uses what he knows to stop the Reverend from killing Garnett. So like because he could have not done that and he would have been free of that group, right? Like, because they would have just systematically taken out all members of that team. But I think that was where he leaned into the team a little bit more because he could have, there's a billion things he could have done that would have just been completely self-serving. But I think that he chose the team route instead.
No, that's fair too. I think it was also when he like kind of had that agreement with that woman in the bathroom where she's like, all right, we'll stick together. And then he just didn't help her at all. And I was like, I get that maybe there was some of that was like, why aren't the zombies attacking me? Right. Like he got stuck in his own thoughts, but it was also like, he's just like, oh, the zombies aren't attacking me. Just walked away, left her to be zombie food. So I think that was the other thing too, where it's like you made an agreement. Now you didn't follow through on that agreement, right? It's like it's not the best thing. But yeah, no, I think it's a really valid point because then when the team is like trapped in the hallway and they're trying to get out and then they finally do break out and they're all there. 10K and I forget who else was it. Cassandra. Yeah, they're able to escape and sort of run off, and so and I don't think Murphy was necessarily aware of that. So you're right. He did sacrifice himself not knowing that there was the potential for, okay, all right, I'll back up a little bit, but not all the way.
No, like I said, I think the things you were saying were still absolutely valid, right? It's just, it's choosing the moment. But what I also really love what you said about he had his verbal contract with someone, the woman in the bathroom area, and then didn't follow through. So I think it still goes to show that it's like that fallibility of being a human where we don't always follow through. We don't always, when people are like, oh, this person made a promise. I'm like, it's not that you should never make promises. You should, and then you should do your best, of course, to follow through with things. But life is complicated. It's way more complicated and there's way more gray space than there is, these black and white areas. So I think that there's still that thing where, like you kind of said, he was still working through like, what does this even mean? And so I don't really know what I just agreed to. So what does all this mean that people are always kind of working through? And so, I mean, at the end of the day, he was still, I don't want to say he was still Murphy. He's not like, I'm not saying he's like a bad person, but at the same time, there's still a lot of stuff he needs to work through that is not going to make him the best team member until he does.
Yeah. And, then when, like, as you're getting towards the end, so Murphy's in that cage. I don't think everyone knows that yet, obviously. They have Garnett, down, and he's talking about, like, do you want to be, do you want to join us, or do you want to become like a zombie, essentially, right? That veiled threat. It was kind of also like that Jacob's cult group. It was like a hostile takeover. You know what I mean? Like a corporate takeover. So now it's like, are you going to buy into this? And you see that all the time, especially in like tech companies, even in like headlines right now, right? So it's like, you have a new person come in that's going to fundamentally change the way the organization is run, right? Same sort of goal, bigger picture goal, right? So still probably going to be a community that feeds people and is that whole thing, but from a drastically different like approach. And so now you have all these people who it's essentially, do you want to keep your job, or do you want to get fired? Are you going to do things the way I want to do them? Or are you going to hold true to that old way? And so I just thought that was really interesting, because you had, Garnett, who was sort of like a third party, was like, you ruined something that was like really good. And like, he was like upset about that, and was lost the major as a friend, right? Was a zombie now. So I thought that was really interesting, because of like, it's either do it the way we want to do it, or get out. And so there wasn't a lot of really great like change management, where I don't think that Jacob was, he's a cult, not a good guy, right? So like, full stop. But he could have approached that with a different energy. And I think you and I were talking about that earlier today, even, right? If he would have gone at that situation and those people, he might have been able to get more buy-in, and there could have been potentially less zombie creation, so to speak, if he would have approached it with a different energy. But, he didn't, because he's a cult leader. But I digress.
It's really interesting too. I hadn't thought about it like from the perspective of like an acquisition versus because that can feel like a hostile takeover. Somebody's threatening the culture that you work so hard to create. So yeah, now you have me thinking more about that too. But I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, no. So I think that was the sort of the interesting piece to me. And then the Murphy piece, where he comes out as not being attacked by the zombies, right? It just how quickly that shattered Jacob's control, right? Like, even his like closest man, right? His like second in command there. How quickly he's like, wait, you told us that like you were the guy that the zombies really wouldn't attack or whatever, and this guy is. So maybe you're not, maybe he is. Maybe we're supposed to listen to him. And I think that just went to show, like, to the point of like Jacob, like how shifting those sands were underneath his feet of like this false leadership. And I think that's like, people were only buying in because of either nothing else better to go to or to do, as well as like it was all built on lies, right? It was one giant lie, and how quickly that can crumble because there's no truth in it. So I thought that was pretty interesting as well. It was his frustration of how quickly he thought. Let me start over. It was how quickly what he thought were these like devoted team members and followers to him, how quickly they were able to shift, right? Like that was such a shot to his ego. It was crazy.
That's a great point though too about if your leadership is built on smoke and mirrors, like it's not leadership at all, right? And it will crumble the moment it's threatened. And I think that's also where like ego in leadership is such a challenge, because then people get questioned, which you should as a leader, absolutely. All questions should be directed to you. And when people get defensive about it, it's like, it's just this assumption of how people are coming at it. Why you think people are asking a question instead of just thinking like a leader and being like, this person is curious, I'm going to answer this question. And maybe people are trying to come at you to make you defensive. But again, leader mindset is, I'm open and I'm curious about the possibilities, and I'm coming at this with no judgment. But if your leadership is not real, if what you're doing is not real, then that is a huge threat, because you can't answer those questions.
Yeah. And you know, that sort of like self-inflated leadership thing, I run into that a lot because it becomes a title-based thing, right? Especially within like program management or Scrum Master, anything, right? So sometimes a title is given strictly to delegate a mindless task, right? So sometimes you'll make someone a team leader, right? Or you know, like a Scrum Master or something like that, strictly because you as the program manager, you know, with 200 or 300 people, you don't have time to sign everyone's timesheet by 1 o'clock on Friday. So you delegate that responsibility down, and, you know, pulling back the corporate veil a little bit, right? You tell somebody they're a team leader or they're like junior manager, because you can sometimes force those people to do more for no extra pay, because you're giving them a title, right? And you're masking in this like, oh, this is a growth opportunity for you. So, but a lot of times, sometimes that fake title will go to people's heads, and you start to lose team members very quickly because, you know, there wasn't a lot of thoughtfulness. You didn't mentor that leader because you just told them they were going to be one. You did nothing to prepare them for that, and sometimes people don't always get the best intention out of that. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing too. You know, and that's a terrible situation, and that's not a leader either. But, you know, people often mix the term manager and leader together, and, you know, you run into some of those issues.
Yes. And I think that there are certain industries that can absolutely get away with that whole, like, I'm going to promote you without promoting you. I know that, like, I know in my industry that would never fly. But I've been in, like, when I was in the military, I was definitely in an E9 position as an E7, and they did frame it like, what an honor, right? Like, this is amazing. It's for your growth and all of that sort of stuff. And yeah, it is a very, especially when you have people who are passionate, who truly care about development and lifelong learning and stuff, they can be very easy to manipulate in that way, because there is this belief that it will be worth it and it will lead to something else that is impactful, or that I could do that's impactful. But ultimately, it's a system that is terrible. And that, I mean, I'm no longer part of that organization, right? For a lot of reasons. But yeah, but I have also seen it, I guess, kind of just in certain industries where, yeah, they'll definitely do the whole, like, what an opportunity. And I'm like, yeah. And now I guess maybe I'm just of the mindset of, like, that opportunity better come with money, because that's how you show people, like work. We can do all these things and build all these relationships and do all that, and we should. But work is a transactional relationship. I am contracted with you between paychecks, right? And when you give me my, like, that's how we are both honoring our side of the contract or of the agreement. I'm going to do the work, and every 2 weeks or every month or however often, whatever cadence, you're going to pay me. And that is the agreement. And there are other things that can be part of that, but that's the base agreement. So it's always really interesting when I hear just stuff like that, where it's like, oh yeah, like, oh, there's this opportunity. Because I was just coaching someone on this the other day, where it was this whole title thing. And, like, yeah, you should be paid for what you do. That's it. I feel like I'm on a soapbox. I'll get off.
I think the other thing too, though, is I think that payment also sets an expectation, right? If you are asking someone to do more and you're not giving more, then you're not really expecting more, which means that if that person was already giving 100% and you're giving them a new task, that there's going to be a 20% loss for, you know what I mean? You're not showing the value of that position. So you're letting somebody not take it seriously. So it's an interesting, it's an interesting thing. So it's kind of like, I don't know, like a rental car. You know what I mean? You drive it like a rental because you don't have a long-term investment in it. So it's an interesting thing. But yeah, that episode 2 sort of on that whole idea of like change management and everything, that episode ends with sort of like a big change to the dynamic of the group as well. So I'm curious to hear what your take is on that.
Yes. Agreed. No, yes, it was interesting because as this thing started to unfold and Jacob threatened the mission. He threatened the mission, right? He said he was going to kill Murphy. Warren goes to try to stop it, and so does Garnett. And so one knocks into someone, Garnett jumps in front of Murphy to save him, right? To save the mission. And so it's really interesting because like that's the most extreme version of really believing in something. But for all of Murphy's behavior, for as far as they'd gotten and things that were lost and things that had happened along the way, I think it was this really remarkable show of this mission is really important and it is worth putting all my chips in, right? For him, it was worth his life. So I think that also signals to other people. He wasn't just like, oops, something happened to Murphy. It was like, no, like, I truly believe in this enough that I'm willing to sacrifice my life, sacrifice my career, sacrifice something for it.
Yeah, no, I saw that too. I have that viewpoint too, where I think he was trying to protect the mission, but I also think he was trying to protect his like co-leader as well. You know what I mean? And so like, I think that was interesting as well, that he really put himself out there to the point of, getting mercied right there. So to protect the team, right? Protect the fellow leadership. And so I think that's a pretty admirable thing. And really, I think, like you said, really helps people buy into the mission overall. Not that I'm saying that's the right thing to do as a leader, but I just, in that situation, I think it was pretty interesting. But it's also now talking about a huge dynamic change moving forward, because that de facto agreed upon person is now, no longer there.
Yeah. And I think, so then so that happened, Murphy goes, he frees everyone else, right? They kind of do their thing. The truck pulls up. And so Murphy gets in the truck, right? So there's that like the mission is safeguarded. We can move this thing forward. And then Warren, of course, in her despair over Garnett, what was really interesting too was, again, it was one of these things of like, we can't do anything about this and we need to move on. So essentially, even the other members of the team stepping in and pulling her away, but just like so symbolic of, we can still move forward with this mission. Like this, we can't do anything about this. We have to get out of here. So I really loved that. And then like later though, so at the time they didn't have the opportunity to mercy him before he turned, but that when they were at a distance that was safe, right? When the team was like back together, you're safe, you're good, you're safe, you're good. We can move forward. But there's this thing that we promised this other person we do, right? There's this loose end that we're going to tie up. And so Warren has the opportunity to mercy Garnett. And I think sometimes too, it's like, even when there's these big changes, it just shows that, like you had mentioned earlier, this is part of grief in the workplace. It's part of loss in the workplace and what that looks like. So can we follow through on our obligations when we are experiencing that? Yes or no? But then also kind of what comes next with that type of a change, like you said.
Yeah. It was a good episode. It was a tough one, but it was a good episode.
Yeah. So many interesting things. Yeah. Like so much shifting for the team. And what I think is interesting now is that like we've had the forming, storming, we were getting to norming. And then what happens next is that we go back, right? So like stages of team development is not just linear, right? It's kind of cyclical depending on all these different factors. So moving forward from here, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the team changes. Like you said, the main leader is gone, but it doesn't mean they lack leadership. So
absolutely.